Hi everybody. So I'm Louise and I'm a philosophy student. I am going to be embarking on my PhD in October. Meanwhile, I'm travelling around writing and researching for my doctoral project. So I wanted to make this video in particular to tell you all about my Cambridge PhD in philosophy interview experience. So, I applied to Cambridge back in the end of November. I have known, obviously, that Cambridge is a wonderful place to do research on my area of research, which is the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who is a German philosopher, and I specialise in Kant's practical philosophy, which means his ethics, his aesthetics, and to be honest with you, you can't really specialise in Kant without really having the superstructure, because obviously Kant is a very systematic philosopher and you can't just simply isolate one part of his oeuvre. So there we go, that's a bit of background there. Anyhow, so I applied to Cambridge back in November. I found out I was shortlisted for interview in January, actually, so there's a very long waiting time, and I must say that this is a bugbear for all of the PhD applications I've done. So waiting to hear anything back from a university seems to take just forever, and Cambridge was no exception. In fact, Cambridge was the second last to update the status of my application. You know, meanwhile I've got offers from everywhere else that I've applied to. I'll talk about that more in another video if that's something you're interested in. So I got the email saying I'd been shortlisted for interview. Now, this was to be a Skype interview. Not only was it going to be a Skype interview in this very vicinity, although with the camera in a different angle, it must be said, and with me looking rather less informal. It was going to be an interview with the Knightsbridge Professor of Philosophy. So I thought I would first talk about the preparation I did for the interview. Now, I'm fortunate enough to know people who are already doing the PhD in philosophy at Cambridge. So when I got this email saying I was invited to interview, I actually panicked because I wasn't aware that Cambridge interviewed for their PhD places. This was not something I'd actually ever heard of. By contrast, last year I actually got onto the PhD in philosophy at Oxford, and that didn't require an interview. So I was expecting a similar process this year with Cambridge. So I started chatting to somebody who I knew from Oxford, because obviously I did my master's at Oxford, and I met somebody there who ended up going to Cambridge for the PhD. And I just messaged her on Facebook and said, what on earth is going to happen in this interview? Because A, I didn't know such a thing could or would happen, and B, in the event of it actually happening, I had no idea what the drill was. So I contacted her wonderful philosopher herself, and she said to me that the interview would be a grilling about the writing samples and research proposal that you submitted with your application materials. So this was fine. I could prepare. I had, I think, 5 days from receiving notice that I'd been shortlisted for interview to prepare for this interview. It has to be said, I spent pretty much the entire time preparing. I grabbed my writing samples. One of them was a published article that I wrote about 2 years ago, actually, but it was published in 20... Sorry, my cat is going completely crazy. I asked my friend, what happened in your interview? And she said they picked apart my writing samples. They offered counter-arguments to them, to which I had to respond. And that went on for the duration of the interview. Given that I had this bit of advice, it's the only advice I actually solicited, I decided that I also was going to focus on my writing samples. Indeed, I thought this was a wise thing to do in any case, since I was, at that point, less familiar with my writing samples than I was with my research proposal, which I had been working on until very recently. Mind you, I had written an inchoate version of it, which got me onto the Oxford PhD. I knew my research topic incredibly well, and to be honest with you, I knew the document. I didn't feel like I really needed to spend that much more time, recalling absolutely everything I said, because I'd pretty much internalised this research proposal by that point. So I decided to spend those 5 days reminding myself of my writing samples. The first one was a published article that I actually wrote as a second-year undergraduate, but which got published in 2016. And the other one was an essay I had also written as a second-year undergraduate, which may come as a huge surprise because obviously you don't expect undergraduate work to be appearing as writing samples for your PhD application. That was what was happening with me. There's a bit of a backstory there, but that might have to take another video. In addition to cramming my writing samples and thinking of counter-arguments to them, and, as it happened, my thinking on these topics had actually moved on quite a bit since writing them. If I was asked to defend something I'd written in a writing sample, I was in... well, there was a very strong possibility that I would actually be saying, well, you know what, I actually agree with you because I no longer interpret Kant in this way. Anyhow, let's talk about the interview itself. The interview began slightly scarily. I was told it would start at 9 AM. And I was sitting right here, having been added as a contact by the person whose Skype account was being used for the interview. So that was all fine and dandy. It comes to 9 o'clock and I'm sitting here thinking, okay, time is elapsing. It got to something like 9:07 and nobody had called me yet. So I was a bit nervous, really, to say the least. And I decided, well, I'm just going to take the initiative and call them. And they didn't answer. The fear created by that situation was very short-lived because within about 30 seconds I then received a call from them and the interview began.